Hello and welcome to this episode of GTR News Weekly. This week we are talking about the skyrocketing prices of GTRs. Now, some recent big sales we saw on the GTR registry and the Unique Cars magazine Japanese Car Value Guide triggered this article. Now, firstly, the highest ever recorded sale price of a Skyline at Japanese auction occurred recently when a 1973 2000 GTR sold for 715,000 Australian dollars. That would end up being over $1 million landed here in Australia. Crazy stuff. There is less than 200 of them built and probably even less of them around, let alone in good condition, so you can see why it's worth big dollars. But $1 million, wow. Now, R32s are on the up. Looking at the car sales website, the cheapest one on there is 80 grand, and they are averaging between that and 100,000 for advertised price. Although price guides from Unique Cars and Shannon's have them being worth more like 55 to 85,000 Australian dollars. Remember, advertised price and actual selling price are rarely the same. But it's still a far cry from the average of 20 grand back in 2011 when I bought my GTR for 10.5 grand. Now, the pricing versus quality and mods is a fair bit all over the shop for R32s, but to command over 100 grand and up to 150 grand, it needs to be a heavily modified, well-built one or an N1. A V-Spec 2 N1 sold for 113 grand at auction in Japan earlier this year, so it's safe to say they're worth about 150 grand. Now, an R32 GTR sold at Shannon's auctions for 142,000 Australian dollars with 10,500 kilometres on the clock. Now, I think that's on the money for a low kilometre and tidy example. I think R32s will continue to slowly climb, but remember, they are the model that was made in the most numbers, by far. So they're the most common, but probably also the most often crashed, raced, or neglected. So good ones are still very hard to find. R33s are coming up as well, with the cheapest on car sales being $80,000, but the spread of pricing is narrower, with not many of them asking over 100. The price rise of the R32 and the R34 has brought the R33 up and along for the ride, but really, it's a great car that deserves its increase in value. Most value guides have them sitting between 60 and 90,000 Australian dollars, and the asking and selling prices are in line with that. So basically, things for the R33 are pretty logical for now. Now, the R34, things are just out of control, and the car is now out of reach for most enthusiasts who grew up wanting one, like me. Luckily, some still have their R34s they bought for reasonable money 5 to 10 years ago. Now, I wish I'd scooped one up for 40 grand back when I could, but hindsight's a wonderful thing. Now, when I went to New Zealand, I got to check out an R34 V-Spec 2 with 40,000 kilometres on the clock that sold for just on 300,000 Australian dollars. Not a NER, not an N1, a V-Spec 2. In America, an R34 V-Spec in Midnight Purple 2 just sold for 418,000 Australian dollars. Now, it's probably enhanced by the fact that it's one of the only combinations of R34 that is eligible for show and display, so it can be legally registered. So rather than having to wait till 2024 and beyond to be able to bring it in. Now, I've also been told that that car could be a giveaway prize car, so the company doing it, if they can generate plenty of ticket sales, well, the price doesn't really matter so much. Did it artificially inflate the price temporarily? Well, logic says it did, but hey, crazy things are happening. Now, here in Australia, the R34 GTR in base, M-Spec and V-Spec trim are advertised for between $215,000 and $280,000. There is a couple of odd listings though where people are asking for 400 grand for whatever reason, and there's a V-Spec Midnight Purple 2 also advertised for 400, probably trying to get an American buyer. But there is a V-Spec 2 Nismo R-Tune for sale for 475 and a V-Spec 2 NER with only 14,000 Ks on the clock advertised for $515,000, but they're both great cars for collectors. But what about a modified R34 GTR? Many saw that War GTR was sold recently, and we can confirm it was for 455,000 Australian dollars. Now, it's a low kilometre V-Spec 2, so it's probably worth 200 to 250 already, but with a huge mod list of the best parts and a big and proven reputation, War GTR was able to demand some pretty big money. Now, I think this is great, as it proves that modified cars can command good money. None of this stock is worth more attitude that I hope doesn't ruin the GTR scene. Now, fair enough, super rare collector cars, you can have that attitude, but for regular models, let's keep modifying them, people. Which leads to my next topic of discussion. How is the price rise affecting the GTR scene? Well, if GTR Festival is anything to go by, there is still plenty of GTRs out there being built and used. But what I have noticed is the quality of the builds has increased, both from a refurbishment or restoration perspective and a modification perspective. Cheap cars get cheap mods. Expensive cars tend to get expensive mods. So the quality of the builds has much improved in the GTR community. The downside of the price rise is the price of used parts has gone through the roof, making it more expensive to fix your GTR if you crash it. So racing is getting more and more risky in that regards. Hopefully it follows the path of muscle cars and aftermarket companies start producing panels, moulds, rubber trims, etc. so we don't have to pay that crazy money that the NISMO Heritage Program is asking. And also so some things just become available again. Parts we used to throw out 10 years ago are now big money. Half cuts are non-existent, and the days of $800 gearboxes and $3,000 engines, they are gone. No more budget builds for GTRs, it seems. So the price rise has its disadvantages, but the GTR scene continues to thrive with big builds, heaps of performance parts being developed, and great GTR events. Now lastly, what caused this price rise? Everyone just keeps saying it's from interest from American buyers, but that's only part of the story. In the same way that 60s and 70s muscle cars had a big price hike when the kids who grew up with them could finally afford them later in life, you know, after you've had your kids and buy a house, etc. A lot of older Japanese men are now buying GTRs as collector's items. There's also reports that some car yards in Japan are refusing to sell them to overseas buyers and trying to keep them in Japan, which is, I guess fair enough. You also need to remember it's not just Americans that want GTRs, people from all over the world, from Russia to the Middle East to South America. The demand is there globally, while at the same time, the pool to choose from is just getting smaller. It's simply supply and demand for a car that has a legit racing pedigree and a huge and iconic reputation. Long live Godzilla.